From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
About 8 people in masks and special equipment rushed on board the ship shouting, "We are from the FSB," gathered the crew on the raft, threatening them with weapons, put them on their knees, and kept them there for a certain period of time. They also conducted a search and took away all computers and all data storage devices.
30 Greenpeace activists remain jailed in Russia facing possible piracy charges after they attempted to board Russia's first Arctic offshore oil drill. We'll speak with Greenpeace International Executive Director Kumi Naidoo in from South Africa. Then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is preparing to release its first major report in 6 years. It's expected to conclude the pace of climate change will continue to accelerate and have a severe impact. We'll speak to meteorologist Jeff Masters of the Weather Underground in our New York studio. Then it's Rolling Stone's Matt Taibbi on his new article, Looting the Pension Funds. 5 years after the financial crisis, Wall Street is picking at the carcass of flat broke city and state governments, blaming public workers and making millions to rescue them. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Obama administration has signed the first-ever treaty regulating the $70 billion global arms trade. The measure regulates the sale of conventional weaponry, including tanks and guns, in a bid to prevent acts of genocide or terrorism. It was approved earlier this year after the White House initially blocked it until after President Obama's bid for re-election. The treaty has come under fierce objection from the National Rifle Association, which has claimed it'll infringe on the right to bear arms. Adding his signature on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Secretary of State John Kerry addressed the gun lobby's concerns.
This treaty will not diminish anyone's freedom. In fact, the treaty recognizes the freedom of both individuals and states to obtain, possess, and use arms for legitimate purposes. Make no mistake, we would never think about supporting a treaty that is inconsistent with the rights of Americans, the rights of American citizens, to be able to exercise their guaranteed rights under our Constitution.
The treaty faces a tough ratification vote in the Senate, where it will need 2/3 support for approval. With the U.S. and 17 other countries newly signing on, more than half the UN's member states are now parties to the treaty. The U.S. and Iran are holding talks today in the highest-level contact between the two sides since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Secretary of State John Kerry and Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif are sitting down with their counterparts from the 5 other countries involved in negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. In Washington, White House spokesperson Jay Carney said the Obama administration views the talks as a test of Iran's recent calls for dialogue.
What we heard from President Rouhani, I think, reflects what we've been hearing, and that is an interest in making progress towards resolving this very serious problem that Iran has over its nuclear weapons program. And that is why, as we've been saying for a while now, including in New York at the United Nations, we are very interested in testing the assertions about that interest on behalf of the Iranians in resolving this conflict diplomatically.
Speaking to the Washington Post, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said he envisions a deal on Iran's nuclear program within months, not years. In an interview with CNN, the Iranian president distanced himself from the denial of the Nazi Holocaust espoused by his predecessor, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Any crime that happens in history against humanity, including the crime that the Nazis committed towards the Jews as well as non-Jewish people, is reprehensible and condemnable as far as we are concerned. This does not mean that, on the other hand, you can say, well, the Nazis committed crimes against, a certain group, now therefore they must usurp the land of another group and occupy it. This, too, is an act that should be condemned in our view.
President Rouhani has been in New York this week for the UN General Assembly. The U.S. and its allies are facing what could be a major setback in efforts to influence the outcome of Syria's civil war. A coalition of Syrian rebel groups is openly split with the Western-backed foreign opposition. In a joint statement, 13 armed rebel factions, including units of the Free Syrian Army, said they reject the authority of the Turkey-based National Coalition, which is backed by countries including the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. The new front has dubbed itself the Islamist Alliance and claims to represent 3/4 of the armed rebels fighting the Assad regime. The alliance's lead signatory is the al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda-linked group deemed a terrorist organization by the United States. The news comes amidst reports members of the UN Security Council have come to an agreement on a draft measure for ridding Syria of chemical weapons. The U.S. and Russia, along with the Council's 3 other permanent members, have been negotiating over a resolution since Washington and Moscow struck a preliminary deal earlier this month. Anonymous Western diplomats say that the core of the UN measure has been reached, but Russia has denied the claim. UN inspectors are now back in Syria, resuming their probe of the alleged use of chemical weapons. The Senate has opened debate on a spending bill that would avert a government shutdown at the end of the month. The Senate took up the bill Wednesday after Republican Senator Ted Cruz ended his marathon quasi-filibuster to delay its consideration. Cruz was backing the House Republican effort to tie government funding to a repeal of Obamacare. But the repeal provision has no chance of passing the Senate, and Democrats plan to strip it from the final version when they send it back to the House on Saturday. Cruz himself joined with all 99 of his Senate colleagues on Wednesday to advance the same measure he had just spent 21 hours trying to stall. House Republicans are expected to shift their focus on repealing Obamacare to the pending vote on raising the federal debt ceiling. On Wednesday, the Treasury Department warned the U.S. could face a default on its debts no later than October 17th unless the borrowing limit is raised. Republicans are now mulling a strategy that would condition a hike to the debt ceiling on a 1-year delay of Obamacare's implementation. Enrollment in the new health care insurance programs created by Obamacare begins on Tuesday, and the law's mandatory coverage requirement takes effect on January 1st. In a victory for food safety advocates, the Senate's bill to avert a government shutdown will reportedly exclude a provision critics dubbed the Monsanto Protection Act. The measure allows companies such as Monsanto to continue selling or planting genetically modified seeds even if courts rule they pose health or environmental risks. It's set to expire at the end of the month after its quiet addition to an earlier spending bill signed by President Obama in March. The bill galvanized the food justice movement, sparking protests and an online petition. Last week, the House passed a spending bill that would extend the Monsanto Protection Act, but Senate Democrats say their bill will let it expire. 4 senators have unveiled a measure to rein in the surveillance powers of the National Security Agency. The bill from Democratic Senators Ron Wyden, Mark Udall, and Richard Blumenthal, as well as Republican Senator Rand Paul, is the most sweeping congressional response to date since Edward Snowden exposed widespread NSA spying in June. At a news conference, Senator Wyden cited what he called a sea change in public opinion as a result of Snowden's leaks. Senator Udall, meanwhile, said the measures in the Intelligence Oversight and Surveillance Reform Act would protect Americans from unjustified intrusion into their private lives, in part by ending the bulk collection of telephone records under Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act.
This package includes ending the bulk collection of millions of Americans' phone records, prohibiting the backdoor searches of Americans' communications, and making the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court more transparent and accountable. Under this bill, the federal government will still be able to get hold of terrorists and spies' phone records, but only where the government can demonstrate a suspected link to terrorism or espionage. And although I strongly believe that some surveillance programs have made us safer, Americans with no link to terrorism or espionage should not have to worry that the NSA is vacuuming up their private information.
Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy is not one of the bill's co-sponsors, but has backed calls for similar reforms. The Senate Intelligence Committee is set to address the proposed NSA reforms at a hearing today. On Wednesday, NSA Chief Keith Alexander criticized the outcry over government surveillance, saying Edward Snowden's leaks had sparked what he called, quote, sensationalized hype. Newly declassified files show the NSA spied on prominent critics of the Vietnam War, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, and Democratic Senator Frank Church. The three were among over 1,600 people on a watch list whose overseas phone calls, telexes, and cables were targeted. President Lyndon Johnson launched the list in 1967 in a bid to see if growing anti-war sentiment was being aided from abroad. The spying continued through 1973 under President Richard Nixon. Just 7 names on the list have been revealed so far. In addition to Dr. King, Ali, and Senator Church, they include 2 journalists, Washington Post humor columnist Art Buchwald and New York Times columnist Tom Wicker. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is claiming he canceled his trip to the UN General Assembly in New York this week due to threats on his safety. Maduro said political opponents were planning what he called provocations and direct threats.
One of the provocations could have led to a situation of violence in New York, and certainly the international campaign was going to begin. Venezuela, Maduro, Venezuela, violence, etc., etc. We are not there for that purpose, and the other provocation was designed to affect my physical integrity.
In his comments, Venezuelan President Maduro cited the alleged involvement of Otto Reich and Roger Noriega, 2 former Republican administration officials who backed the 2000 coup that briefly ousted Maduro's successor, Hugo Chavez. Maduro clashed with the State Department last week after he was briefly denied access to U.S. airspace on his way to China. The Customs and Border Protection Agency has announced new guidelines following a spate of deadly shootings by agents on the northern and southern borders. At least 19 people have been killed by border agents since 2010. The victims include at least 6 Mexicans killed on Mexican territory. 16-year-old Jose Rodriguez was reportedly shot from behind no fewer than 7 times last October for allegedly throwing rocks at an agent. The new changes include a training program that will emphasize the diffusing of threats instead of resorting to deadly force. In a statement, the American Civil Liberties Union called the measures inadequate, saying, quote, the biggest missing piece here is clear and transparent accountability for officers involved in use of force incidents that lead to serious physical injury or death. Without a commitment to end the culture of impunity at CBP, the agency's good first steps will lead nowhere, they said. A former Black Panther held in solitary confinement for over 40 years in Louisiana has filed a bid for compassionate release after being given just weeks to live. Herman Wallace and 2 others known as the Angola Three were placed in solitary in 1972 following their conviction for murdering a prison guard. The Angola Three and their supporters say they were framed for their political activism. According to his attorneys, Herman Wallace, now 71 years old, has been diagnosed with terminal liver cancer and is just weeks from death. He's seeking compassionate release to spend his last days in hospice care. In Sweden, the 2013 Right Livelihood Awards have been announced for 4 recipients. Paul F. Walker of Green Cross International for, quote, working tirelessly to rid the world of chemical weapons. Raji Surani, director of the Gaza-based Palestinian Center for Human Rights, for a, quote, unwavering dedication to the rule of law and human rights under exceptionally difficult circumstances. Congolese gynecologist Denis Mukwege for his courageous work healing women survivors of wartime sexual violence and speaking up about its root causes. And the Swiss agronomist Hans Herren for his expertise and pioneering work in promoting a safe, secure, and sustainable global food supply. Handed out annually, the Right Livelihood Awards are widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize and will be given out in the Swedish Parliament in December. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.